The title of my talk is Big Pharma, the Nazis and the Origins of the EU. And it's about the things that we're not supposed to know about. It's a bit of a stretch to understand how an organization primarily focused on natural health approaches ended up researching history, European history specifically. And so part of what I'll be talking about this afternoon will be to try to explain this and explain how we arrived at where we got to. So we still haven't got the title slide yet, but I'm sure it's coming soon. It's being worked on. Okay. So to begin with, it became apparent to us as the European Union legislature developed that its approach towards natural health remedies was a rather draconian, restrictive one. I'm talking here about directives from Brussels, such as the Food Supplements Directive, the Traditional Herbal Medicinal Products Directive, and something called the Nutrition and Health Claims Regulation. And these all are essentially draconian approaches to natural remedies, natural therapies. And they essentially treat such approaches as if they were as dangerous or even more dangerous than drugs, which is clearly absurd. I mean, vitamins are found in foods and things like that. So, it seems fairly obvious that nature intended us to use them in the maintenance of our health. What happened was, as we first became aware of this type of legislation, we began to look a little bit into the historical origins of the European Union and the basic blueprint on which it was based. And, as I say, we're a science-based organization, so we did this, and we're still doing this with a semi-dispassionate approach. But we feel, as Andy sort of said there, that these are things that we need to know about. If we can determine that these things are truthful, if we can determine they are based on absolute historical fact, we believe that we need to factor them into our understanding of Europe and the world around us. So this is where we got to, and what we did, we began by conducting research in international archives around the world, archives in Europe, but also in the United States. And in the process of doing this, we uncovered literally tens of thousands of original historical documents that, as we sort of put it, have essentially been forgotten about. These are documents that history is essentially almost ignored. And as we began to look at these documents and study them, a rather different picture emerged that tells a slightly different story to the, shall we say, the official story about the history of Europe that we've been told about. And this led us into eventually writing a book about this, and we also put all of these documents online. I'll get to, if we eventually get any slides up, I'll get to the website where you can find all these and download them as PDFs for yourself. So it's been an exhaustive search. It's been an exhaustive process of research in arriving at the point where we're at now, where we think we have a pretty good idea of the historical origins of the European Union model, the principal architects who designed it, and their philosophies and things like this. And as Andy said, it's a controversial issue. It doesn't really matter which side of the, shall we say, the Brexit argument you're on. If the stuff that I'm going to be sharing with you all this afternoon is true, there are some pretty profound implications. I mean, I should say straight away, my sort of position and the position of our foundation, it's that we are supporters of the concept of a united Europe. We're not, opposed to that. But we believe, which is where I'll get to towards the end of the talk, we believe that the model should be a Europe for the people. The model can only be based on the types of truthful reports and analysis that you're getting here from all of the speakers here this weekend. Because if that's not the case, I mean, let's face it, in general, without singling out any specific individuals, in general, our politicians do not have a particularly good reputation or history for being factual and open and honest with us, sharing the truth. And that may be putting it lightly. I'm trying to be diplomatic. So that means, in fact, as the previous speaker also concluded with her talk just now, that means it's almost sort of incumbent on us to discover the truth for ourselves. It means that we have to learn the things that our leaders, and I use that quote advisedly in quotation marks, our leaders have not told us about. Because there's clearly a lot. One of the first documents that I'll be showing you in a few moments, hopefully, is a CIA memo from the early 1990s, the CIA being the Criminal Investigation Authority in the United States. And this makes it clear that even by the early 1990s, the CIA had contacts, operatives, and influence over every wire service, newspaper, and media outlet in the United States. Okay, so this is 25 years ago. So if we want to go and look and examine why it is we are not being given the truth through the media, if we want to understand why we haven't got the free media that we are told that we apparently have, this is a good place to start, because the intelligence community, not just in the United States, but I think it's fair to assume here as well, has influence over what we are told, over what is reported to us. And so the cover-up begins in some senses with that, but it's also, as you will begin to see, it's also a matter of us being shown the facts and us finding out the facts, as I say, for ourselves. Jolly good, jolly good. Okay. I've done half the talk, I'm almost finished now. Okay. It's a good test, though, isn't it, really? It's a good test whether I really know what I'm talking about. And I'll let you draw your own conclusions about that. Okay, so we have these historical documents. There's tens of thousands of them. Obviously, there's not time this afternoon to share them all with you. Hey, fantastic, okay. Does this mean I can press this and change it? In theory. Aha, okay. So there's the title. That's what I've been talking about. Hold on. In theory. Okay, here's the CIA memo. We're doing very well. Fantastic. So this was a memo from 1991, and it shows that by then, and I quote, the CIA had relationships with reporters from every major wire service, newspaper, news weekly, and television network in the United States. That's pretty big, really, for 25, 26 years ago. It also describes how in many instances, and get this, the CIA had persuaded, it's an interesting word, isn't it? Persuaded reporters to postpone, change, hold, or even scrap stories. So there are influences over the media other than the concept that we have a free press, because we clearly don't. If we had a free press, we probably wouldn't have the need to have events like this. This event, if I recall correctly, has been going on for 27 years now, which is a tremendous achievement. But it's also a reflection that for a long, long time, we haven't been told the truth. Okay, so here's a little sample of some of the documents. Here is the website. We've put all of the documents on this website. I'll leave it up there for a few seconds if you want to take a photograph or write it down or something. They're all available as PDFs and things. There's various different ways of accessing them. But they're all there. We think this is too important not to be shared. It was a mammoth task getting them all online, but they're there. Okay, a little quiz. Who said the European people are part of one family in this world? It is not prudent to think that it will be possible to maintain this community of nations inside a diverse legal system and within different legal values. Any ideas, anybody, who might have said that? Ah, either you're a very knowledgeable, informed audience, or you've got a damned lucky guess. But you're right. Yeah. Okay. So, the bloodiest war, the most murderous events in certainly modern history, the chief perpetrator in charge of that war, the perpetration of that war, apparently also had ideas about what he would do afterwards. I'll get into this a little bit more, but I'm very impressed that you knew who that was. I guess the Nazi in the title earlier probably partly gave it away, but okay. So the history of how the Nazis were planning to implement this idea really sort of begins in Rome in May 1938. In May 1938, Hitler and Mussolini, the Italian fascist leader, meet in Rome to agree the launch of World War II and the conquest of Europe, and then, hopefully, they thought, the world. The following month, it's a bit like when David Davis goes to Brussels and they meet sort of monthly and decide to implement the plans or otherwise to do with Brexit. The following month, a delegation from Nazi Germany was sent to Rome to set in motion the implementation of the economic and legal plans that Hitler and Mussolini had discussed. And one of the leading members of the official Nazi state delegation to Rome was a man called Walter Hallstein. Professor Walter Hallstein was an expert in international economic law. Now, the thing about Hallstein was that he went on to become the first president of the European Commission. The European Commission, I'm sure most of you know, is essentially the executive body of Europe. It's 28 people, one from each country, possibly eventually to become 27. We'll see how that goes. And this is its Berlaymont building in Brussels, where it lives and works. So Hallstein is sort of celebrated, really, as one of the founding fathers of Europe. If you look at the EU website, this is pretty much literally how it portrays him. If you're into symbolism, okay, it's just a little oddity, really, but an aerial shot of the Berlaymont building actually resembles a swastika symbol of his previous masters. I'm not particularly a symbolist myself, but I know some people are. So here's an interesting document. So Ig Farben was a pharmaceutical, chemical, and petrochemical cartel that played a major role in the perpetration and planning of World War II. And this is, now we're sort of getting to the sort of parts that have been written out of history, really. Because we're told a lot of things about World War II, but we haven't been told about Farben's role. I need to hurry a little bit here because I realize we're already half an hour through and there's quite a lot of slides to go. Okay, so this document was written by one of the directors of Farben to the Nazi government, and it describes a Europe under the leadership of the Nazis and the Ig Farben companies. It talks about a common currency being necessary for Europe, and of course a common patent law. Well, we now have a European Patent Office, and of course we also have a currency. By 1941, the plans had moved on somewhat further, and the Nazi regime, we now know, was maintaining several official institutes with one purpose only, and that was preparing the future economic and political shape of the world for a Nazi victory. One of these research institutes was based in Dresden, in Germany, and this man here, Arno Solter, was the head of this office. So in 1941, he summarized these plans in a book issued by his office. And I'll go through this a bit briskly. We have a copy of this book in our foundation's library. And again, modern-day concepts that are described in this blueprint include the European Commission, the unelected executive body I talked about there, and the system of EU directives as the principal lawmaking approach for Europe. And again, that word is the word that is used today. That word, as well as the concept of the European Commission, that word has survived to today. Okay, on to Hallstein. So there are things, as I hinted just before, that the EU clearly would rather we didn't know about Hallstein. But in the interests of truth, I think we have to be aware of these things. So the first thing is that before and during World War II, Hallstein was a member of official Nazi organizations. One of them was the Association of National Socialist German Lawyers, which was founded in 1933, immediately after the Nazis had seized power. 3 years later, this was converted to the now notorious Nazi Association of Law Protectors, a very disingenuous word there. And membership of this organization was restricted to those individuals who showed uncompromising support for not just Nazi activity, but Nazi philosophy. And Hallstein was a member of both of these organizations. How do we know that? Well, we have a copy of a memorandum sent by him to the representative of the Nazi government at the University of Rostock in Germany in 1935. And this states quite unequivocally he's a member of both of those organizations at that time. But the key thing that really raised our eyebrows about Hallstein was not just the membership of these organizations, but it was the philosophy that he was active in promoting. There was a key pre-war propaganda speech that he gave a few months before the outbreak of World War II in 1939 in this place. It's still there, this building, in Rostock in Germany. And a key aspect of the speech that he gave concerned the link-up of Austria with what used to be known as Czechoslovakia, with Germany. And he described the seizing of these countries as being part of the creation of the greater German Reich and the legal Germanization of what he referred to as the new territories. You see, to Hallstein as a lawyer, the perpetration of the war that he knew was coming was not simply, it was not a matter of invading countries, so much as it was a legal matter. In fact, he actually stated in this speech that the failure to create what he referred to as a unified legal system for Greater Germany was one of the unfinished tasks and failures of the Second German Reich. Now, the Second German Reich covers that period through the end of the 19th century up until the end of the First World War. So he was regretting the outcome, the fact that Germany didn't succeed in its war aims in the First World War, and saying essentially that this had to be renewed, this attempt to expand Germany's borders and create a greater Germany. He was lamenting the failure, but he was saying, now we have an opportunity to do this. He described again this word, the legal process for the creation of this unified legal system, as being the issuing of directives. So yet again we have this word, the word that appeared in the book, Arno Scholter's book I showed you a moment ago, and Hallstein again, separately, independently, using the same word. And he also described the creation of this Greater German Reich as being an economic event. You see, again to Hallstein, these were legal matters and economic matters. The creation of this Greater Germany, this new Europe, was an economic matter. But the most shocking thing of all, the thing that really woke us up to the fact that the architects of Europe were perhaps missing in their autobiographical notes that we are told about, we were missing part of the facts that Hallstein stated in this speech that one of the most important laws to be introduced in the annexed countries, the invaded countries, was the law for the protection of the German blood and the German honor. In other words, he advocated the imposition of the Nuremberg racial laws on the occupied countries. These laws, of course, excluded German Jews from German citizenship, and they prevented them from marrying or having sexual relations with people of German or related blood. I mean, quite an astonishing thing for a man to say. How do we know he said these things? Well, we have a copy of the original manuscript. We have a copy of that. You can download it from the website I gave you earlier. We know what he said. We have a copy of a newspaper report from the following day confirming the date of the speech, the title of the speech, the venue of the speech, and it describes how the attendees included the entire elite of the Nazi state in the region. This was an event that actually was an invitation event. If we can get the next slide up. There we go. So we have a copy of the official invitation to the event, and it was no accident that the entire Nazi elite at that time in that region were present to hear this speech. The invitation confirms the date of the speech, the venue, the title of the speech, and that the speaker was Walter Hallstein. So we have multiple corroborative evidence. So we have to ask ourselves, how did Hallstein come to sign the treaties of Rome? Because it's sort of unthinkable that a man with this background and these philosophies could come to be sitting there in Rome in 1957 to sign these documents and set in motion the Europe that we now have around us today. Well, a part of the clue for that, we have to look at the corporate aspects of this. Sometimes we are misled into thinking that the corporate world, the globalization that we are witnessing today, is a relatively modern development. It's not. In fact, corporate control over governments, not just in Europe but in the United States, this is something that goes back for a very, very, very long time. Multinational corporations have always sought to influence and control governments. It's how they become multinational and maintain their multinational power in the first place. And after the Second World War, the Ig Farben Cartel that I mentioned earlier, which consisted primarily of Bayer, the drug company, BASF, the chemicals company, and Hoechst, the drug company, chemicals, which is now part of Sanofi-Aventis, and other companies, smaller companies. These were featured in one of the Nuremberg trials. Now, there was a total of 13 trials after the Second World War. The one that got all the attention was the first one, the one involving the main war criminals, the Nazi leaders. But after that, what got a lot less attention was that there were 12 more trials, and the sixth of those subsequent 12 trials was one against Ig Farben. And one of the interesting things about this is that discussing the charges against one of the senior directors of Farben, this man here, Fritz Termeer, his legal counsel specifically stated that the concept of a total European economic area had shaped Termeer's war aims. It was a sort of a flimsy defense, really. The lawyer was saying, okay, my client stands accused of some heinous crimes, but his aims are honorable. His aims were the creation of a total European economic area. Well, it didn't succeed as a defense, but it may have been treated rather more leniently than most of us are aware. You see, he was found guilty of war crimes, Termeer, as were most of his colleagues. He was found guilty of plunder, spoliation, slavery, and mass murder. The mass murder part involving what happened at Auschwitz, which I'll briefly touch on in a few moments. But he only got 7 years in prison. I mean, it's quite astonishing that a convicted war criminal who would get 7 years and then be released after only serving 2 years. It doesn't really bear thinking about. And then, in 1956, fully aware that he was a convicted war criminal, Bayer appointed him as chairman of its supervisory board. And he went on to hold that post for another 8 years. So, to all intents and purposes, like a number of the senior perpetrators of the war at that time, he was back in his old job, almost as if nothing had ever happened. General Telford Taylor, no relation, I might add, but a very fine gentleman, said he was the counsel for the prosecution at Nuremberg trial against Farben, and he said, quite unequivocally, without Ig Farben, the Second World War would not have been possible. Pretty big. I mean, something pretty major that's been sort of written out of history. We haven't been told this. There are many, many documents to prove this, and of course, Taylor and his team presented them all at the trial. But look at this one. This one shows that Ig Farben invested over 80 million Reichsmark in the Nazis. In modern day money, that would be around 600 million pounds. More than £500 million. Imagine today, right? Imagine today that one company gave that sort of money to a political party. I mean, it would be outrageous. Outrageous. Ig Farben, the companies, gave that much money to the Nazi Party and other Nazi organizations. There were certainly other companies that helped fund the war, but the principal architects, the principal funders of it were Ig Farben. Colonel Bernard Bernstein was an author of a military report on Ig Farben, and he said, quite outright, he said, without IG's immense production facilities, its far-reaching research and worldwide economic power, the German war could never have been waged. Again, a pretty major statement. Amounts to the same thing that Taylor said. Here's one of the extracts from that report, 1945 US military report. I won't read it all out. It says, IG was responsible for a very large percentage of the production of many of the critical war materials, without which the war could not have functioned, the war could not have happened. 28 of the 43 main products or product groups produced by Ig Farben in 1943, this is the example here, were of primary concern to the Wehrmacht. Listen to these percentages that Farben accounted for. The synthetic rubber that was used for the tanks and military vehicles, 100%, all of that was produced by Ig Farben. The lubricating oil for the vehicles, 100%. Poisonous gases, 95%. Explosives, 84% of the explosives used by the Nazi army produced by Ig Farben. Gunpowder, 70%. I mean, astonishing. That one cartel of companies. See, this means that Ig Farben, as Telford Taylor said and as Bernstein said, enabled the Nazis to fight the war. 100% of the synthetic rubber came from Farben. Okay, I'm not going to go back. So the bombings that took place, the bombing of London and Paris, the destruction in the Netherlands, the bombing of Stalingrad, the devastation that took place in Greece, and even the Zyklon B that was used to kill millions in the gas chambers at Auschwitz was supplied by an Ig Farben subsidiary company, Degesch. Ig Farben was the most important influence and facilitator over the war. The most shocking, for our foundation as a health organization, the most shocking thing among the Ig Farben Nuremberg documents relates to the criminal medical experiments conducted on the inmates of Auschwitz and other concentration camps. Because you see, we have been told that the medical experiments conducted by the Nazis on concentration camp inmates were perverted experiments conducted by vicious Nazi, people. Well, certainly, it is certainly true that that accounts for part of the proportion of experiments that took place. But experiments were conducted on them also using patented drugs and vaccines produced by Bayer, Hoechst, and other Ig Farben companies. The Nuremberg trial documents make this clear. Deadly tests were conducted by Bayer employees, such as this man here, Helmut Wetter, and were used to develop what went on to become the first generation of what we now call chemotherapy drugs. Do you get that? So the chemotherapy drugs today are directly descended from tests that were carried out using inmates of Auschwitz and other concentration camps as guinea pigs. We even know what these chemicals were and their numbers, their patent numbers at that time. You see on this one here, Bayer. This is a part of the history of the war and the process that led up to the formation of what we now call the European Union. It's almost been entirely erased from history. And either I'm making this up, I've come here this afternoon with a deliberate attempt to mislead you, or there's something in here that if we want to move to a better Europe, if we want to create a better world, we have to figure it into our account, our understanding of what took place and how we can avoid these same mistakes occurring again. Our organization has worked very closely with survivors of Auschwitz. They are, I can honestly say to you, among the most remarkable people that I've ever met. They are truly remarkable. I guess you'd have to be to survive something like that. We've given several conferences over the years at Auschwitz, and it's always not simply just a pleasure, but I feel deeply respectful for the work that they are doing. As they put it, never again. When they say never again, obviously they know about the things that I'm talking to you about today, and the fact that they are still, many of them clearly they live for the purpose of sharing the facts, the historical facts, and doing their best, the same as we all are, to try to make a better world. But you see, Ig Farben was not just the driving force behind the Second World War. the cartel of companies was formed in 1925, but it was also deeply involved in the preparations and perpetration of the First World War as well. In 1910, 4 years before the outbreak of World War I, the German emperor and the army supplied by BASF already knew how to make bombs from air, nitrogen bombs. BASF took out the patent on the technology that enabled the German army to produce bombs from air. World War I, of course, was also the first time that chemical warfare agents were introduced as weapons of mass destruction. And who owned the patents on the mustard gas and other chemical warfare agents? Bayer. Bayer was the owner of the mustard gas and other chemical warfare agent patents. Then we come to the goal of World War I, because it's strikingly similar to what I described about the planning for the post-World War II Europe. This is something known as the September Program, and it was published by the office of Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, who was the German Chancellor at that time. And this was published just 6 weeks after the outbreak of World War I. Listen to this. He said, "Our goal is to enforce a Central European Economic Union with joint custom regulations that includes France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Austria-Hungary, Poland, and potentially Italy, Sweden and Norway. This union under German leadership has to stabilize the economic dominance of Germany over Central Europe." You see, setting aside the whole politicization of this, we have to understand that this plan has been in preparation for a long time. And in fact, and here, none of the three main political parties come out looking very good, neither the Conservatives, the Labour Party, or what they were then the Liberals. Because from the late 1960s, senior representatives from all three of those parties were closely involved with something called the Action Committee for the United States of Europe. And this played a key background role in ensuring that Britain would be joining the then European Economic Community. The longest-serving member of that committee's executive committee was this man, Kurt George Kiesinger. He'd been a member of the Nazi Party in the 1930s and had worked in the Nazi Foreign Ministry radio propaganda division during World War II. So he knew the plan. He knew what the plan always was. And he was on that committee, I can only presume, because he wanted to do his best to ensure that those plans reached fulfillment. I briefly touched on the issue of the euro before. You see, it's fairly obvious that if you want to control a country, you need to control its currency. And this has been understood again for a very long time. As early as February 1914, shortly before the outbreak of World War I, an official US government report described what it referred to as the maxim of the House of Rothschild and the foundation principle of European banks. And it was this: let us control the money of a country and we care not who makes its laws. You see, the architects, the modern-day architects of the euro that we have now, always knew that a financial crisis would result from its introduction. They weren't stupid. We know this because in 2001, in the Financial Times, a very little-noticed quote from Romano Prodi, who at that time was the head of the European Commission, he said, "I am sure the euro will oblige us to introduce a new set of economic policy instruments. It is politically impossible to propose that now," he said, meaning in 2001, "but someday there will be a crisis and new instruments will be created." So they knew the euro was flawed. They knew that it would result in economic devastation in the poorest countries, but they knew that they could use this to bring in laws that they couldn't bring in at that time. Pretty cynical, really. If you're somebody like me and my colleagues who believe that what we need is a Europe of the people, I mean, this sort of cynical planning is about 1 million light years from that, really, isn't it? So here's the book. We think this is too important just to sort of sell books. So if you go to this website, you can download all of the individual chapters of the book for free as PDFs. And if you're a little bit old-fashioned, like me, and you like thumbing through books and storing books on your bookshelves, there's a link there on that site where you can also go somewhere where you can buy a copy as well. We published it 6 years ago, and it's now available in 12 languages, and it's pretty much all over the world now. So this is really the message, really. This is really why when Andy contacted me at the end of last year, I think it was, and said, would I come and speak today? This is the reason that I'm here. I'm not here to espouse any particular ideology or anything, just historical facts that we can prove. And the message of George Santayana here, the philosopher and writer, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. History does sometimes have an uncomfortable ability to repeat itself. And it can only do this if we are ignorant of the facts, if we are ignorant of the historical events that led to some of the things that I've been talking about this afternoon. Because a Europe designed, surely, in the interest of its people, can only come about if we are willing and able to learn the lessons of the past. As I often say, the way the world will be changed will not be through our politicians. It's through events like this, organized by Andy and his colleagues today. These sorts of events are always the best places to come and learn the truth, because it's for the people, by the people, of the people, which, if I'm allowed to share one bit of personal philosophy, for me, this is the sort of Europe and the sort of world that I would support. So, in our own different ways, we're all searching for some sort of enlightenment. Again, it's what brings us here today. We're all searching for enlightenment, and the truth can be the only thing that can lead us to enlightenment. If we're searching for knowledge, if we're searching for the answers that I'm sure all of the speakers here this weekend will be looking to share with you, the only way we can reach that is to find out the truth, ceaselessly searching for the truth and learning from it to try our very best to make a better Europe and a better world. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Oh, got about 20 minutes. Want any questions?
Yeah, why not? Yeah, why not?
Okay. Well, very unusually, a speaker has finished early. So we've got some time for questions, and I think there might be a few. So we could raise up the lights a bit so we can see everybody, and Sheila and I will rove. So do we have any questions for Paul? Yes? One over here. Hold on. If you could pass the mic down the row for me.
Isn't it true that a lot of the people who worked at Ig Farben were also taken after the war to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip? And that's how it went across the Atlantic there?
Certainly a lot of German scientists after the war were appropriated and essentially given new lives in the United States. A famous example, of course, not from Ig Farben, was, of course, Werner von Braun, who was the father of German rocketry, and of course he was taken and became one of the key figures at NASA. So yeah, there's a great many German scientists like that who were used and given new lives in that way. Yeah, certainly.
Got one at the back here. Hold on.
Just a comment in a way. There we were all thinking that fake news is a new phenomenon. But if implicit in what you're saying though there, if we aren't informed of this stuff that's gone on in the past, how can we learn from it?
Well, I mean, I'm not quite sure I fully understand the question, but I mean, it's the last couple of points that I was trying to make that I would really reiterate here. Because if we want to know where we're going, which again, and if I understand correctly, that's a part of the reason we're all here today. If we want to know where we're going, we have to know how we got here. What was it that led us to this point? Because regardless, as I say, I want to try and cross the sort of political divide, not take a position on this, just the pure history. But if we want to make a better Europe, if we want to make a better world, we have to understand, that globalization plays a part. I would imagine that there'd be very few people here today who would dispute the fact that globalization is one of our challenges, let's put it that way. And my point being that globalization has been going on, except it wasn't called that, but for a long time. One of the biggest problems is that companies seek to and achieve control over governments. The United States is in a particularly dire state because of that right now. It also happens here, of course, and elsewhere in Europe. But we have to understand the situation before we can, let's say, with one voice, say what it is that we're wanting. Blindly proceeding in any direction without understanding what got us here, in my opinion, is not very advisable. So this is, again, as I said, why I agreed to come here, because I think that we need to understand history. There's no harm from understanding history, and at the very, very least, we can learn some things that will help us to have more informed opinions on some of the key issues that challenge us today.
Got another question here.
Hi. I've heard a similar speech given by Peter Hitchens, and it's on YouTube if anybody wants to look it up. The other thing that he talks about is the role of Russia. And I wondered if your research covered any aspects about the relationships with Russia and what is currently being portrayed as a threat that possibly isn't.
Yeah. The answer to the first part of the question is no, that we haven't done any special research on Russia, though clearly it intersects with some of the things that we've been looking at. But let me just say another little thing again now, my sort of personal opinion, is that I think in some ways we all share a part of the truth. And one of the great things about the internet is the fact that it makes it so easy to look at the same news reporting in other countries, you know. And I think it's pretty obvious if you do that, you soon arrive at the point where you realize that actually, you know, everybody's news media in all the countries is misleading people in various different ways. And the logical conclusion you come to is that in various different ways, no matter how small, they all share a part of the truth. And again, in some ways the truth is, you know, can be different for all of us. But there are certain historical facts, certain historical evidence that we need to factor in. In the news media, the fake news media, as Trump is fond of calling it, you know, or I would simply counter by saying everybody, you know, be they bloggers, be they social media reporting, you know, or even the mass media. The truth is out there, but in today's complicated world, we need to do a lot of work to figure out what it is.
Any question? Yes? Okay. Yeah, well, I'll come to you in a moment. This lady was first. Here we go.
Hi. You said that the vast sums of money that were poured into World War I and World War II probably couldn't happen today at today's amounts. You said, what was that? I think it was
600 billion. It wasn't quite what I said. I said that it would be very difficult for one single company to, or group of companies, to put that amount of money into a single government.
It is happening. It is well documented as happening, and I just happen to have this book that I've just started, and it's the winner of the 2017 Pulitzer Prize for Investigative Reporting, and it shows the vast amounts of money being poured through spurious front companies or shell companies through Panama into Syria via Russian and German banks, HSBC here, and it is happening and we're oblivious to it, and I'm stunned.
I will read that book, okay. So, I mean, I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that corporate funding of governments is not happening. It's happening all the time. But I'm just saying that Ig Farben enabled the war, and, you know, this is again an example of the fact that the internet has become one of our most important tools, really, because I was aware of the Panama Papers. I haven't studied that carefully. That's not one of my particular areas of expertise. But it would be very difficult for the companies that I was talking about that still exist to openly put that amount of money into any one government. The Panama Papers clearly, and there will be other leaks, which, you know, I would say these are all to our benefit. The more we can learn about the corporate control of our governments, surely we must all be left better off for knowing about this than not.
Okay, here we go.
Hello. Yes, the people that you've talked about that come from the Hitler era and their descendants and the companies, aren't they going to be doing everything they can to stop Brexit happening?
Well, the people from that era are all pretty much dead now, so
No, I mean,
there's little
and
they can
the
do. But you mean
descendants,
their descendants,
yeah.
their sort of successors? Yeah. I mean, I think
like
that
the Rothschilds.
I would agree with that as a point in principle. I mean, it's pretty obvious, you know. Or at the very least, do their best to destroy the British economy if they can,
Yes.
to prevent it. Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty logical conclusion that,
Yeah.
you know, would be difficult to disagree with, yeah.
Any other questions? Oh, yep, loads. Hold on. That gentleman was first. I'll come to you in a minute. Pop your hand up again. Where were you? There we are. Hold on.
Back to Russia again. I don't know how much you know about this, but if Hitler hadn't decided to invade Russia, and why did he, having made a peace treaty with them? And was it all thought out, or was it only his decision, or do you know anything?
Well, you have to realise that the planning for World War II clearly shows, when you look at the documents, that it wasn't just the takeover of Europe, it was the conquest of the world. That was the plan. You know, Hitler lied to the British, you know, when he said he wouldn't invade Poland and things. And, you know, despotic, you know, people like that always behave like that. You know, it's one of the features of that type of physical, psychological makeup, I guess.
Okay, one more here.
Adolf Hitler clearly outlined in Mein Kampf, it's a pretty turgid read, but he did outline precisely what he planned to do. Now, you say he seized power, it was a rigged election, but essentially you know, he was democratically elected in the face of it.
Seized power afterwards, but
Exactly
democratically
right.
elected, yeah.
Why was everybody, including our government, so intent in ignoring this guy? Because Mein Kampf was a huge, big seller in this country in the 1930s. I mean, he bombed his own factory, essentially, but it was a huge seller. We ignored it. Any idea why?
Well, I mean, this point has been disputed by historians for years, really, hasn't it? I mean, my personal, again, I can only answer in a personal capacity. My opinion is that sometimes when the most awful things around us are happening as human beings, we try to deny the living facts before our eyes. We try to pretend that it's not happening, and we try to pretend that it won't be as bad as it may be looking to be turning out. And I think it's, you know, there's various, you know, physical, psychological theories that would account for this. Groupthink. Groupthink is an extraordinarily powerful thing, really. And if enough people can be convincing themselves in positions of power that something will or will not happen, it's pretty easy to convince others. But, I mean, no one will ever really know the answer to that question. It's much easier for us to look back with a historical eye on that era and to draw links and comparisons and things. But I'm sure it's probably a little bit dangerous to assume it should have been easy for them, because it clearly wasn't until it was almost too late.
Where was the other gentleman who had a hand up here? Yep, here we go. Hold on. If you could pass that down.
Thanks. Very interesting talk. I was just thinking about Walter Hallstein. Now, it sounds like a Jewish name. I don't know if he was Jewish.
Not that I'm aware of.
If he was, I mean, that seems a bit of an anomaly, if he was Jewish, to be working with the Nazis. I don't know, your thoughts?
I don't know enough. The founder of our organization is a German physician and scientist, and he would probably know more about the biographical details of Hallstein than I. So far as I'm aware, there were not any Jewish links in his ancestry, but you've intrigued me there. I may have to go away and research that.
One right at the front here.
Thank you. You started off from a natural health.
Yeah.
So these are all household names. These are the people making vaccines, chemotherapy, whatever. Should we trust them?
Well, I mean, you know, I can be outright and say that, you know, we say that the pharmaceutical industry is the biggest barrier to health. That's pretty much our position, you know. In fact, the Profit Over Life website, where we house the Nuremberg documents and all of the other things that you can download and see the other stuff we found, the Profit Over Life name that we gave it was simply in recognition of the pharma industry's philosophy. It puts profit before life, you know, and You know, from our philosophy, as I say, you know, people first, people before profit. It's very simple, really. And I think eventually, hopefully, we may reach the point where we can get people into positions of power who recognize that. And maybe that may be one of our primary tasks in the months and years ahead, you know.
Any more? Okay, well, all right, one more. It's the last one. Last question. Hold on, wait for the mic.
Hello, the name of the website, Dr. Rath Foundation. Can you explain why it's called that, where the name comes?
Dr. Rath is the founder and president of the group of companies that the foundation is a part of. The foundation is the non-profit arm of the group, and we promote primarily natural health approaches. This is a little sidearm interest, really, which we arrived at in the way I described at the beginning of the talk this afternoon. And we believe that natural health approaches are the only way to effectively and safely maintain health, prevent health, and even, yes, and treat disease. So we fund a research institute in the United States, the Dr. Rath Research Institute, and that institute has had now over, if you're aware, the US National Library of Medicine, PubMed, which is the largest collection of studies on the internet, our scientists have had over 100 studies published on that website. So, you know, natural health, opposition to the pharma industry, opposition to profit before life, these are all of our philosophies. Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure, everybody.
Paul Anthony Taylor, thank you. Brilliant. Thanks very much. Thank you. Great stuff. Thank you.